The four themes are providence, faith, courage, and suffering. These four themes have examples shown in the Lord of the Rings and in the shadow of his wings. But before I can tell you how they are shown, you need to know what they each are first. Providence. It is that God has a plan, and everything works out according to that plan. Some of you may ask, aren't we free though? Can't we make our own decisions? Perfect question. We are free. We make free choices. God just knows what our free choices are, while not being the cause of them. We don't have freedom if He chooses our choices, but He doesn't. Also, if we say He is our Lord of history, it doesn't mean He is our primary agent of history. We are instead. But our sin cannot even frustrate His plan. The cross was man's greatest act of sin, but yet it became the greatest single act of God. Faith. What do you think faith is? Do you say believing in something? Well, it's not quite so. Faith is trusting God, and it involves the act of surrender. Often, we need to surrender and trust God because He knows what He is doing. Abraham had great faith. Abraham surrendered and trusted God. He did this with his son. He was willing to give him up to God, and he trusted Him. Having faith leads you to courage. Courage. It isn't the absence of fear. It is the fear that has said its prayers. We are usually afraid when faced with an unavoidable evil. The more centered we are on our own will, the more fear we have. The more we are attached to God's will, the less fear and stress we have. If we trust in God, the less fear we have because we are less attached to the results and our own will. Faith and hope drive out fear and stress. Suffering. To understand suffering, we have to understand what evil is first. There are two types of evil, physical and moral evil. Moral evil is what is the result of a free choice. If someone were to throw a rock at you and make you bleed, it is a moral evil. But if it is not the result of a free choice, it is a physical evil. If the wind hits you with a rock and makes you bleed, it is a physical evil. 99% of the world's suffering is moral evil. It isn't God's fault. It's ours. Suffering is a gap between what we want and, as we get older, what we choose. The root of suffering is a lack of conformity to God's will. The stronger our will is, the more we suffer. The only answer to suffering is Christ's answer to the cross. We have to embrace it like Christ did. Now you know what providence, faith, courage, and suffering are. I can finally tell you how they are shown in the Lord of the Rings and in the shadow of his wings. So first up is providence. There is an example of providence in the shadow of his wings. It is about Goldman becoming a Franciscan priest. Well, at least a deacon so far. Goldman knew since he was a young boy that he wanted to become a Franciscan priest. Even Sister Solana had prayed for him to help him also. Sister Solana knew that after 20 years, Goldman would become a priest. She told Goldman about this too. Then the event Sister Solana had predicted had started to come true. He didn't go to Russia and went to Lourdes instead. He then went to Italy with the troops. Later, he even became a deacon. God had wanted Goldman to become a priest, and he wanted to also. This is an example of providence in the shadow of his wings. Next is faith. There is an example of faith also in the shadow of his wings, and it relates to the example of providence. Sister Solana had faith in God. She had faith that he would make Goldman a priest. She trusted him and surrendered her will. She and the other sisters kept praying every day for 20 years. Then the event she believed would occur did actually happen. She had faith in God, that God would make her prayers come true. This is an example of faith. The next example is of courage in the Two Towers. It was when Sam and Frodo are in Shelob's lair. Sam attacks Shelob and tries to save Frodo. Sam wasn't fearless at that moment. He was afraid. But Sam attacked Shelob and did what he could to rescue his friend. Sam knew he had to save his friend. He loved Frodo, and he knew their quest wasn't over yet. Last but not least is suffering. There is an example of suffering in The Return of the King. Faramir was suffering from a moral evil. He was suffering from the Black Dread. He had been shot by an arrow from the Nazgul. The Nazgul chose to attack and had injured Faramir. He was then burning with fever. This is an example of moral evil. There is also an example of a physical evil from the shadow of his wings. It was the death of Goldman's mother. These are examples of suffering in the novels. The four themes are providence, faith, courage, and suffering. Examples of these can be found all over the Lord of the Rings and the shadow of his wings. Suffering in God's providence is when we truly develop our faith and perfect our courage.